My name is Rune Christoffer Dragsdahl, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vegetarian Society of Denmark. So our organization is working with the plant-based transition from throughout the food system. So in collaboration with multiple other organizations, professionals from the food system, but trying to inspire and enlighten people, but also in how to practically implement more plant-based diets in everyday life. But that also does include influencing politicians and talking with many professionals throughout the food system. So we were actually founded by doctors in 1896. So very old organization indeed, one of the oldest in the world within our field of work. And at that time, health was really an important driving force, something about natural lifestyle. That was kind of an important sentiment in many, I think especially in Northern European countries at that time. The animal ethical part was also there. It was also seen as a relationship between the two. So not harming animals was part of the philosophy. But there is actually a precursor to it, because during the First World War, Denmark was rationing its resources in order to feed the people efficiently during the war. So that meant that Denmark did at that time reduce its pig production to 20% and the cattle production to around 65 or 70%. And that was a way to feed more people. And actually, as you might know, Germany is widely seen as losing the First World War because they were not able to feed their population in an efficient way. Even the Second World War, there's some evidence that seems like that was also a decisive factor in Nazi Germany losing that war too. So we're actually talking in these times where everyone is talking about geopolitics and war and food security and food self-sovereignty in a complex global world. With increasing the security agenda is getting higher up. This is actually an argument for taking agriculture and food even more seriously, and why the plant-based agenda is also an important part of this. So we do actually have that historical precedent in Denmark related to that, which then comes in a new shape, of course, in the 60s and 70s with the green movement, of the birth of the organic movement around that time also. But then, of course, in the last 10 to 20 years, the climate and environmental movement, and that is an increasingly motivation for many people, and that's also why I think we still see more stuff happening at a larger level technologically and politically, is because of environment and climate. So in our organization, we stand on all three pillars, whether it's health, animal ethics, or sustainability. They are related, you can say. Denmark is still the country in the world with the largest animal production per capita. Yeah. We also do have a very high level of animal consumption per capita, although some countries are higher than us. We're still pretty high in consumption. We're doing many things. We have several colleagues who are doing a lot of work in collaboration with, for example, hospitals or conference centers, amusement parks, canteens, various sorts of places where someone is preparing the food for others, where you have food professionals. And that is usually because that is one of the most efficient ways to quickly transform things in a way, where you get help from professionals. As I usually say, we need help, we need professional help, because a lot of people, while they have the best intentions, it's very difficult in the everyday life to change it. So actually making plant-based meals and food products available, easy, affordable, delicious in everyday life is really what matters. So I have many colleagues just working on that in collaboration with other stakeholders throughout the food ecosystem of Denmark. And I think that's really the main thing that will ultimately change things on a practical level, is getting the products and the meals out there to people, nudging people, the food environments, these things where you make the plant-based options appear either as a default, to make it the default. Currently, you often have to ask for something plant-based. It should be the opposite way around. But also choosing delicious names, menu design, where the plant-based options are first on the menu, etc. So I have several colleagues working on that together with professionals, and that is where we have the actual impact on what is being eaten and sold and produced, you can say. But at a more strategical, structural level, we've also been able to, together with other organizations in Denmark, pave the way for the plant-based food grant with 170 million euros and the world's first national action plan for plant-based foods. And these two initiatives have caught so much attention across the world that actually a lot of what we're also now doing some of my colleagues and myself is now actually spreading that message to other countries. So, for example, for this year and the next few years, we'll be working on what we're calling Danish plant-based diplomacy. So that is traveling across Europe and trying to share the story, how the Danish farmers are actually backing this in Denmark. Sharing that story with farmers in other countries, saying there's no reason to be against this. You can be for this if you're a farmer. This is about more plants. It's not an agenda which is against something or someone. And I think we can see from many officials in other countries to see that, hey, that's a royal crown kind of logo on something called an action plan for plant-based foods, that helps mainstream this a lot. And then the grant itself, which has supported a lot of great things, such as a new vegetarian chef degree at the hospitality school here, training multiple chefs across public and private kitchens, supporting research projects where scientists and startups are developing tasty but also healthy textures that imitate meat, but with great nutritional profiles, helping farmers develop new seeds, etc., and new trials of new crops that can be grown in Denmark. So, all these things, sharing that story with other countries to basically make people lower their elbows or shoulders, or what you say, to say, hey, relax, this does not have to be a drama or a conflict. This is something we can all be on board together about developing something positive, a positive vision. Private and the professional kitchens. There you have to educate some professionals, but it is their job to make food. And usually they're interested in enhancing their skills, competences. It can even attract new people. We can see the new plant-based chef education in Denmark is attracting new students with a different profile, more women, a few years older. So overall, managing to attract people to a sector which is actually generally across Europe having difficulty in attracting staff. So it's just a great example So within the professional world, I'm extremely highly optimistic that this is about training, inspiring, and of course that will require some government funding or private funding, but then things can happen there. In terms of private consumption, that's much more challenging, and that's because people are still busy. Retailers are not doing enough. They say they're doing a lot and they're even losing money, they're saying sometimes, on introducing things, but then overall I think there's quite solid evidence showing that you need a quite large selection of plant-based products to really tip the scale. So even if they feel they're going from 3 to 5% of their protein solutions that are plant-based, that's just such a tiny fraction. So that's not really inspiring people enough. There is a huge variety of products. So if all the best current existing plant-based products were on the shelves in all supermarkets, I'm sure sales would shift simply through having a much more interesting variety there. But it's tricky because they're afraid of pissing off the consumers and losing customers. And there's some structural issues here that are really challenging. One challenge I do think we're still facing, and that's an intervention that we're also focusing on now, but we have been looking for funding for it, but got some funding recently that made us able to upscale this, but we still need more in the future. And I know it's the same problem in other countries. Health nutrition professionals, so many misconceptions that will die from protein deficiency or calcium deficiency. When protein was discovered, for many years, it was called egg white in Danish. You can still see today, if you go to Germany, on the ingredients lists in Germany, it still says eiweiß. So that's still the word. So the fact that protein is labeled as something from eggs, science has been developing terms over a specific understanding of something coming from eggs. And that's just shows how difficult this is and how challenging this is to work with. So I still think that's a major issue in many countries. We can also see the FAO internationally, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, is still hesitant towards more plant-based diets. Fortunately, the Eat Lancet diet, the Eat Lancet Commission are doing a lot with great respected researchers from top universities to challenge that, to show, you can have a very healthy diet, which is strongly plant-based or even entirely plant-based, but there's still a lot to work with. So in terms of obviously our policy work, we are proud of the fact that we, together with other good stakeholders, but I know many have also been giving us credit for it, like having been able to pave the way for the world's first action plan for plant-based foods, and this government granting scheme with 170 million euros. That is clearly something that we're proud of, and we're grateful for all the people who've been supporting it, the politicians who've done the work in the negotiations, and other organizations who've been collaborating regarding this. The other impact, of course, when you look into, for example, nudging or product development, then of course ultimately you would have to track and trace are more meals being sold that are plant-based, and also would it maybe replace some animal products to really have an overall impact. Again, I think we can see that in professional kitchens, it's possible to see some links where we're currently, many of the projects we're designing with other stakeholders will include some trial runs. So if it's a takeaway sector project, then we'll trial it out in maybe 10 takeaway kitchens before then seeing what worked and what didn't work, and then scale it up. Care centers for elderly people, again, trying it out in some kitchens before scaling it up. And the same goes for conference centers, where we have some nudging experiments in conference centers where we've been trying some nudges, and then the best ones of them will be recommended to be scaled up across the sector. So I guess this is how we measure it, through trial and error, and through collaborating with professional partners who are the ones who can count meals and products being sold. The subsidies are overwhelmingly supporting animal foods, and there's been some research last year from, I think, Leiden University, who published a study showing that 80% of the CAP funding directly or indirectly supports animal farming. Some of it is through by supporting a hectare, no matter what you grow on the hectare, but supporting that direct support in that way, you basically make animal feed artificially cheap, and thereby it becomes more viable to use huge amounts of animal feed to send them through the animals. And then there's a direct support for slaughtering animals that Denmark, for example, has. It comes in different forms and shapes across the EU. On top of that, there's research funding. There's also marketing funding, and the general issue with a lot of the research funding, and especially marketing funding, it requires own contribution. So say own contribution requirement is 50%, or sometimes less, but let's say it's 50%. So the problem is, if you're a big company, you can easily afford to spend 5 million, and then you get 5 million in support. But if you're a startup, at best you can find 100,000 and then get 100,000. So while in percentage it seems like a fair system, and of course there are adjustments, there are also regulations whereby smaller companies can get higher percentages, like 70%, and larger can only get 60 or 50. But even with that, overall, the way that is constructed just means that the large companies get the most subsidies, and that's not a healthy system for innovation. That's a major barrier, both in Denmark and across Europe, that as a startup you're really facing an uphill, unfair series of choices where all the incentives you get, most of them at least, go towards animal-based. There's something about the true pricing. You do need to have actual prices that reflect the costs for society. The tricky thing about that, though, is that if you do introduce that, if you did it overnight, it would mean a massive increase in the prices of animal products, because the true price for animal welfare and not polluting waters and climate change, it would be really, you would have to pay much more than today. The thing is, the farmers wouldn't be worse off. They would just be producing less animals, but they would get the same income. It's just a whole system that would have to change. So who comes first, the consumer or the producer? That's where I think sometimes we actually do agree a bit with the farmers when they're saying this is all about demand. Kind of. Like, we don't agree with the argument that demand is coming out of nowhere. The demand is there exactly because the subsidies shape the whole system in a direction towards a high animal consumption, and that's how it has been shaped historically. So that demand, and because companies invest money in marketing their cheap animal products, and the retailers put them more cheaply on sale to attract customers into the store, etc. So in that sense, it's a very fake argument to say that demand is the issue. That said, demand is the issue, sort of, in the sense of if there was such a thing as a pure demand, or a demand cleansed of this, and if there were true prices, etc., then demand is the issue. Ultimately, someone has to eat more plant-based, otherwise the equation won't go up. And I think that's actually the problem we did have with the Danish deal last year, with this big deal with 40 billion crowns being spent to buy out farmland and converting into nature and forest. While egoistically, from a Danish perspective, it was very much needed. Our water is in bad shape, very polluted. We need it to biodiversity. Birds are disappearing, getting extinct. we needed this in Denmark, egoistically, but if we just shut down production and no one eats something else somewhere in the world, we just shift it, we just cause more deforestation in the Amazon, for example, in South America. So, and that's where we feel the Nature Conservation Society of Denmark is focusing to one side, it's just on getting more nature in Denmark, stopping some production. So therefore, funnily enough, on that one, we agree with the farmers that we don't want to reduce food production overall. But in order to get more nature and still produce the same amount of food or even more, you do have to switch to more plant-based production. And that's where we ultimately, someone has to eat something else. So we fundamentally believe in carrot measures rather than stick measures, simply from it would be just, you can say, to use the stick. Companies normally have to pay for pollution, but in the real world of what happens and how the world looks like, we think the realistic way forward is to focus on the carrots. So it's different incentives to help stimulate plant-based development, to help plant-based startups develop new products with research grants, to help educate chefs in kitchens, to help educate children in schools. That's the way we build, and that's the philosophy behind the Danish plant-based food grant. That's from a realistic point of view. Like, while things could be fixed much faster if true prices were implemented, but that is not going to happen realistically, we think. So that's why we do think having grants and incentives to develop the plant-based sector is the way forward, and we think that will be the way forward in many other countries as well. So I think the way we engage with all these stakeholders is being, fact-based, science-based, and being inspirational and positive, and also being pragmatic. So, like, for example, I would always insist that the scientists, the climate scientists, environmental scientists, what they're saying would require huge change, but I won't be demanding that this is happening then in 2 or 3 or 5 years, because then no one will listen to me. I can't get any influence. So I have to distinguish between what is objectively needed. The sooner the better. We don't have 20 years to wait for it, but still what is objectively needed, and then what is currently feasible politically right now. So keeping the eye on the long-term vision and the short-term, each ball that has to be played, you can say, and that. So that would very concretely mean, if there are specific negotiations and there is not a majority willing to do something, then you have to see, but what is then possible at this particular moment in time? And if that is adding some funding for training chefs or developing plant-based products, then we would tell the politicians, this is what we really would need to prioritize right now, at least some funding. So instead of politicians having clean hands and staying outside dirty compromises, we need more idealistic politicians to get their hands dirty and become part of those compromises. And in terms of generally businesses, farmers, I think this is about showing, again, that we are on this together, and it's a positive vision, and it's the interest of everyone to share that narrative. We created a network in 2020 we call Danish Network for Plant Proteins, which has now like 250 members, and that has all been about information, inspiration, networking. I think that's where to start. In many countries, that might be the right place to start. Simply create a network, organize some events where people meet and greet, and we remember to invite the people you disagree with. I think that's an important place. Something else, one of the first things we did 7-8 years ago was actually to suggest to some politicians that they should ask the ministry for a calculation of the health economic benefits if people were eating more plant-based and or following dietary guidelines. But that's normally the same. If you follow dietary guidelines, you have to eat more plants. So ask for a calculation of that, an official calculation. Then in this case here, the ministry here asked the University of Copenhagen, and then came up with a calculation. And that's very useful, because once you have that calculation, you can use that onwards, saying, if you say it's too expensive to invest in plant-based, well, here's a number proving that it's worthwhile for our health system. I do have the advice that, I think especially for plant-based advocates to be pragmatic, to build bridges, and from people from the other side of the spectrum to also be open to the fact that there are many plant-based advocates who are, have innovative minds, who are part of the solution. So it's tricky here, because we generally want to avoid this being about identity. It's not about being a vegetarian or being a vegan. And I think part of the problem here then is that you have some vegetarians and vegans who are still too much on the identity side, who talk about it in that way, and that is really pushing other people away. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of people who use vegetarians and vegans as an excuse for not taking responsible action. So I feel there's something here where we have to find some common ground in that. and one of my main, it's actually a colleague of mine who developed it, sort of a slide, a graph showing basically, when we talk about dietary guidelines or climate targets, for example, or the Eat Lancet diet, it can sound like everyone have to follow this diet and then we'll be one happy family and we'll all be the same. That sounds extremely boring also for many people. It sounds like I don't know, people feel this is a dictatorship or communism or something. I don't know, people would have all sorts of reactions against this uniform idea that we will all just follow dietary guidelines. And I think it sounds beautiful, but when I express it that way, you can also hear some people will say, no, we don't want to be that uniform. And the truth is there will always be a normal distribution in society in diets. So there was my colleague who came up with this point, basically showing that if we want to approach this realistically, there will always, at best, we might have 40% who will reach the dietary guidelines and be just on the dietary guidelines. And then there'll be at least 30%, at least maybe more, who will eat more meat and way more meat than the dietary guidelines. But that also means that we should be very, very happy about those other 30% who are flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, and vegan, because they are helping the total equilibrium. They're helping bring in the balance, which also means, as I normally say, if you really, really love meat, then you should give your vegan friends a very big hug, because they're kind of keeping your quota large enough for you to have your happy meat consumption. And the wonderful thing about this is not just some clever rhetoric or something. It's actually very mathematically true. There's no way to reach climate goals where we also respect that some people will be eating more meat if we don't support those people who really do want to eat less meat. They should have much more support in their daily life. If you make it very, very easy and accessible, you're not taking something away from those who love their meat, but you will help 30% to eat very plant-based. And that's probably the only way to mathematically for the world to reach its standards. National level, it is about working towards getting actual changes in consumption within Denmark. Because really to get a global change, we do need some of those countries who eat too little plants and too many animal products. We need to see change here. So I think working on that with other organizations here is really on the daily, very practical real level, finding ways where more professional players can take more responsibility, whether it's companies or food service or politicians in Denmark. But then, so that's on the one side, the national stuff in Denmark. But then I do think also internationally, we do have this ambition to keep being very available for people from around the world who want to hear about this crazy Danish story and inspire and normalize this. So I think that the plans now we have for the summit in October and also the COP30 in Brazil and beyond that as well in the upcoming years, both within the EU and globally, I think we'll have to keep sharing this story that, as I usually say, if this can happen in Denmark, the country famous for meat and dairy, if it can happen in Denmark, it can happen anywhere. And we need to keep sharing that story.